name is Abby Roberts, Director of Merrill Insight, our M&A and Due Diligence Thought Leadership Program. And I'm delighted to welcome you here today to our 2019 Corporate Development Outlook, Opportunity, Processes, and Predictions. Before we can talk about our agenda, I just need to pause really briefly to let you take a look at our legal disclaimer. All opinions expressed in the presentation today are the opinions of the panelists and the moderator, and not necessarily those of Merrill or DataSite One. And we don't guarantee the accuracy or reliability of the information provided herein. Okay, that done. We've got a really packed agenda here for you today. So please bear with us because we are going to touch on a lot of different topics, and we're going to try to get through them fairly quickly. So for the first half of our webinar, we're planning to focus on global and regional big picture trends, including market outlook, regional and technology trends, and global risks. And during that time, we'll be also asking you polling questions about those global trends, which will sort of match the polling questions from last week, where we had the first part of this series. This is actually the second Corporate Development Outlook, where we asked EMEA and Americas audience the same questions. So we'll be able to compare and contrast, which I think will be quite interesting. And then in the second half of our webinar, we're really going to focus on APAC due diligence considerations, best practices, and local perspective. And at the very end of the presentation, we'll have time for audience Q&A. Okay. So before we can get to all of those exciting themes, however, I do have some housekeeping items to go through. Almost there, I promise. So first, a replay will be available within 24 hours. You can click on slides to answer the polling questions, and there are a lot of polling questions. And the reason there are a lot of polling questions is because you, the audience, who we do really consider to be another panelist in this entire webinar, have said in the survey, and you can find the survey in the button below, that you really like the polling questions and you like being engaged that way. So click on the slides to answer the polling questions and get your fingers all fired up. You can also ask Q&A throughout the panel, and then we will handle it at the very end. And you can find the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can also read a lot of related materials in our resources button. So there's a lot of information packed in the resources box. And I often get the question, oh, we would like more research. It's all in there. We have Merrill DataSite's One most recent M&A Insider, which is going to give you the entire global perspective of deals November year to date. Hazel's team at Freshfields has also provided us with some really good, really topical information on 2019 outlook and some of the protectionism issues that we'll be talking about more in depth today. And we also have a DataSite One quick start guide for those of you curious about DataSite One. And speaking about DataSite One, the last button on the right of your screen is our DataSite One button. So you can, if you're not familiar with DataSite One, we are a due diligence platform for M&A and other transactions globally. And you can find out more about us by clicking on the button and taking a look. And we hope that you do. Okay. So really, this hour, it's up to you to decide how you want to use it. It's not just about watching us on video on the screen, unless that's what you want to do. There are lots of other ways to engage, and we hope you'll do that. Okay, finally ready to get started. Thank you for bearing with me. So one of the things I'm most excited about our program today is that we have a really nice wide variety of panelists. All three of our panelists cover different regions and come at it from different angles, whether regulatory or corporate development or investment related. So I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, starting with Hazel.
Thank you, Abby, and hello, everyone. I'm happy to be part of the panel discussion here. My name is Hazel Yin. I am an antitrust partner and the co-head of the China antitrust practice of Freshfields. I'm based in Beijing, and I advise on merger control, antitrust investigation, and compliance, and national security issues. Over the past year, I have worked on some of the most high-profile transactions, such as Google's acquisition of Motorola, Nokia's acquisition of Alcatel. Thank you.
Okay, Chris?
Hello, everybody. My name is Chris Tran. I head up Northridge Partners for Asia, based in Singapore. We work with technology entrepreneurs to execute strategy, raise capital, and exit via M&A or IPO. Some of our deals include the first autonomous vehicle exit for Southeast Asia, which was the sale of Quantum Inventions to Continental, and also the Series B for A-Commerce, which was led by KKR-backed Emerald Media.
Okay, fantastic. And now moving into our first section of the webinar, again, focusing on global and regional big picture trends. And as I said, we think of you, the audience, as our next panelist. I'm going to ask you to sort of introduce yourselves with our first polling question, which is, what direction is the M&A market headed? Positive, neutral, or negative? As a reminder, click on the slides to answer. And while our audience is answering, Hazel, what do you think people are thinking about here?
I think people must have a very complicated feeling about this question. If we look at the, as I did, if we look at the numbers in 2018, actually we're seeing quite a robust M&A market. The global deal value has increased for about 10% compared with the data in 2017. But we also see a growing segment over protectionism, tightened foreign direct investment control in major jurisdictions, trade tensions, Brexit, and so forth. Fortunately, in APAC, we have been seeing mostly a similar trend of growing M&A activities, and this is consistent with our view and our observation that the APAC region has remained deal-making friendly. So overall, I would say that I'm still cautiously optimistic that M&A activities next year will continue to grow.
Okay. Well, let's take a quick look at what the audience has to say. Well, Hazel, it looks like they're kind of with you on the positive front. Chris, does this surprise you?
Not at all. We have a lot of reasons for optimism. There's a lot of cash in the system and a lot of cash from a variety of sources, not just the amount of funds that have been raised, but a lot of corporate venture capital groups, family offices, etc., that are really looking to do more deals in a region which exhibits a lot of growth and a lot of technologically driven growth as well. So we're not surprised, and in fact we believe that deal volume and number of deals done is the one to watch out for, because although the public market valuations have been tempered, this tempering is actually good as it provides encouragement for those that have been waiting on the sidelines, and also it provides a real flight to quality for the top companies as well. Those top companies will exhibit continued robust valuations due to their unique characteristics and their leadership positions.
Okay, wonderful. And I'm just going to move to the next slide so you can see how the EMEA and Americas audience is answered. And you can see that overall people were neutral, but actually if you break it out, EMEA was positive like APAC. So I think that's quite interesting. And while you guys are taking a look at this slide, I actually am so embarrassed. I forgot to ask Simon to introduce himself. So Simon, do you mind introducing yourselves while people take a look at our market outlook trending data?
No worries, Abby. Hi, I'm Simon. I head up the M&A team for Dentsu Aegis Network in Asia Pacific, which in our world is everything between India and New Zealand, excluding Japan. I've been doing that role for about 3 years. Before that, I did have a similar role looking after the EMEA region. And over that sort of 6-year period, have led or been responsible for over 50 deals for Dentsu Aegis Network.
Okay, thanks, Simon.
Thank you very much.
No, sorry about that again. That's never happened before. So I was so anxious to get to market outlook. I apologize. All right, so moving on to our next question, going down from the global view to more of the regional, next question is really, what are kind of like the regional hotspots? And Hazel, I'm hoping you can kick us off with this one.
Sure. From the China perspective, there are encouraging signs from both outbound investment and inbound investment. For outbound investment, we continue to see China has become one of the most active investors investing outside of the region, especially after the acceleration of Chinese government's approval for outbound transactions. On the inbound side, we're seeing that China has continued to be one of the most attractive destinations for foreign direct investment. In 2018, China has attracted a total of $135 billion worth of foreign direct investment, which hits a historical high over the past years. And China has been taking steps to open up its market, which is one of the few G20s that have been doing so in the current geopolitical environment. For example, China has been gradually moving up its restrictions for foreign investors' shareholding ratio in traditionally protected sectors such as automobile and financial services. And in response to a policy movement, multinational companies such as Tesla and BMW have all committed to invest in multi-billion US dollar manufacturing sites in China, which is all very exciting.
Yeah, and China is definitely the 800-pound gorilla, I think. And just as a reminder, you can take a look at our resources box and find some really good data kind of backing that up and sort of giving you that hardcore data information. But Chris, sort of what's your view on your regional front?
Sure. So for us, Indonesia remains very interesting. It's got an amazing size, 300 million people. It's got a wonderful demographic dividend to come, very young population. And this is a population that is fully digitized. It's skipped the desktop exposure to the internet, and most of the exposure to the internet is actually through mobile for the very first time. In addition, overall, there's been a lot of government and policy moves in the right direction to make the country so much more transparent, a high amount of governance to really increase the investment friendliness of Indonesia. We're also very bullish on Vietnam. Vietnam is similar, and although smaller and 90 million and probably just the third, it has the advantage, however, of manufacturing and high quality, low cost software development capability. So, for example, few people realize that Vietnam is a manufacturer of Samsung TVs, Samsung screens. It manufactures Mazda 3s, and also out of Vietnam are really large software development homes, for example, for Magento, which is, of course, the very popular e-commerce software.
And Simon, how about on your end of things?
Yeah, I tend to agree with Chris that Indonesia and Vietnam are very exciting markets within Southeast Asia. I also see India continuing to be a very exciting market with lots of opportunities, with such a highly qualified workforce, huge exposure to some of the Western markets, and a lot of that technology and exposure being translated into opportunities within APAC itself. So very bullish on India. Overall, just lots of opportunity in the region, I believe.
Okay, great. So we got China, Indonesia, Vietnam, and India sound like the top hotspots here. And moving on, so one of the things that I always find very interesting, and I think everyone does, is that, obviously there's been a lot of global market turmoil lately. And for every kind of downside, there's usually an up, particularly in financial services industry. So one of the questions that we really wanted to ask is, what do you see as the biggest upside from the market slowdown? Is it sensible valuations, distressed sales, more flexible payment terms, or less frantic sale processes? And while the audience is firing up their fingers and answering this polling question, Simon, you want to give this a shot?
Yeah, I think as the market slows down, There's always less pressure on pricing, but the top quality assets will always be highly sought after, therefore highly competitive, and therefore will always be premiumly priced. Often what you see is that the number 2 or number 3 player just doesn't achieve the exit or doesn't sell. So I think there'll still be pressure for the high quality on pricing. But what we will see is more buyer-friendly processes where buyers simply won't be pushed into being rushed or making decisions before they fully understand or have all the information. They just won't be willing to take that kind of risk. So I think we'll see more buyer-friendly processes that allow people to fully understand before they jump into bed.
Interesting. All right. Well, let's take a quick look to see what the audience has to say here. All right. Sensible valuations, which is really no surprise. But yeah, it looks like a lot of people said less frantic sale processes as well, and just distressed sales. So there are a lot of really good upsides here. And I do think, Simon, it's interesting what you're saying, because we heard from so many clients last year about just sort of the sheer hecticness of the sale processes. And just for the audience's sake, here's a quick snapshot of what the Americas and EMEA had to say. And like APAC, of course, they all said sensible valuations. But I think that they were slightly heavier on more flexible deal terms, meaning I think a lot of people are kind of looking forward to being able to ask for earnouts and for it to not be quite such a strong seller's market, so that they can have more favorable buyer terms involved. Moving on, and this is always my favorite section, actually, and it's so interesting, is what technology trend do you expect to dominate M&A conversations and why? And we have 2 technology guys on our panel today, so I'm going to ask Chris to kick this one off.
Sure. So for us, big data and AI, data is definitely the new oil, and the economic war or competition over it will be over this new oil. Certainly we see, for example, in the payment space, digital payment platforms that have the ability to convert cash to cashless payments, accumulate that data, and then provide financial services, not only in better and new ways to existing clients, but to new customers who have never seen it before and experienced it before. And to really bring it to life, an example is NextPay in Vietnam. And this is effectively the Square and Stripe equivalent for Vietnam. NextPay, apart from payments services that it provides to its ecosystem, provides its merchants with the ability to extend credit, which the merchants have never had before. So obviously the merchants are now able to affect larger ticket sizes. In addition, for other merchants, it is providing them the ability to receive instant cash settlements. And that's a huge benefit, where typically the merchant would have to do a lot of paperwork and wait, for example, for up to 30 to 45 days to receive cash settlement. The other area we see, and which is a little bit less talked about, is smart manufacturing and logistics. Smart manufacturing and logistics will augment high-value labor as a source of competitive advantage for this region. And here we have a Singapore company called Sesto, which provides autonomous robots to high-end manufacturing clients, both regionally and abroad.
Yeah. And Chris, we were talking before the panel. I have to follow up a little bit here, because one of the audience questions from last week, which I asked you and then you answered so well, is, do you think AI is a bit overhyped? I mean, I feel like it's all we've heard about for like a year. What do you say?
Sure. We don't believe AI is overhyped. We believe it's actually very widely misunderstood. So to be very clear, there's 2 types broadly of AI. There's generalized AI, where, effectively it's like in Iron Man. You think that there's this marvelous computer that can just run the world. And we're very, very, very far from that. The reality is that most advances in AI has been the vast accumulation of data thanks to the internet, and the ability to use that internet through that data created through the internet to apply AI for very specific and specialized purposes. And through automation did for us as humans. It allowed us to focus on what makes us uniquely human. So for us, we actually view AI as the opportunity for us to focus on human compassion and human creativity that no computer will ever be able to replicate us on. And we see a lot of net benefits around AI, notwithstanding the, of course, security concerns and challenges.
Yeah, and I that's such a great, hopeful answer, and I love it because I'm definitely one of those people who can stay up at night worrying about kind of the Terminator scenario. So I appreciate that view. Chris, Simon, on your end of things, what are you seeing from the technology trend standpoint?
I think it's very similar to Chris, but all driven through the advertising media industry pushing towards personalization. So really being able to target and track and identify connecting brands with individuals and with much greater accuracy. And that's all driven through data and automation. And this is where we see AI. Automation is very, very much less sexy terminology, but is probably a better description of what we see. So automating the process and then also driven by dynamic and significantly more content requirements to really target the individual's needs and wants. So we're seeing a lot more of that, and I do believe that will continue.
Yeah, and again, we were talking beforehand about how it's a bit different too than here in the States. You were saying we have sort of the clunkier version where you almost get stalked by like a furniture company or something, whereas what you're talking about is a far more kind of refined view of personalization. Is that right?
Yeah, I think clearly this is a product. The personalization is on a journey. And it's not perfect yet. And I think there is an element of, you get the Google ads that follow you around even when you've purchased the item. But, people are getting better at doing this, and it will take some time. But I believe we are getting better at it. And we're focused very much around supporting brands going direct to consumers, and they're much better able to control the message through that. So it's an evolution, and we'll continue to get better at it.
Cool. All right. So moving on to our risks section and our next polling section, which is what global emerging risks do you think will climb farthest up due diligence checklist in 2019? Climate change, trade wars, Brexit, Facebook tech giant data privacy concerns. And Simon, do you want to give this one a shot while the audience weighs in?
Yeah, sure. I think as Chris and I have talked about, and Chris used the term, data is the new oil. We're going to see more and more businesses that have large data sets, and with that comes compliance with local regulation and international regulation. So I think that the diligence to ensure that targets have complied with that is going to be a really critical part. And obviously there's a very big difference between being a small independent, where perhaps there isn't such a high degree of focus on compliance rather than a big international. So I think we're going to see a large amount of activity and the diligence around that area.
Okay. Well, let's take a quick look to see what the audience is going to say to this one. All right. Wow, trade wars really kind of takes everything else by a mile. And that's really not too surprising, I guess, given the kind of geopolitical environment. And I'm just going to move quickly on so you can see what the Americas and EMEA said. And not surprisingly, trade wars dominated the dealmakers' view of the Americas as well. And even in EMEA, which I think is particularly interesting, kind of given what's going on with Brexit, EMEA dealmakers even said trade wars were a bigger due diligence concern than Brexit. So I do think you can sort of see this global view of how it's dominating the conversation. And Hazel will talk a little bit more about some of these in a minute. But I did want to kind of quickly also go into, timely data that we got, which also just shows the drop in China-U.S. deal making over the last couple of years, probably due in part to these issues. So you can sort of see the steep drop there, and then Europe kind of going up in terms of outbound China M&A as a result of that. Okay, so next polling question on the risk section, and we are getting closer to the second portion, but aside from investor confidence, which we felt like if we put this in as a polling question, everyone would just say it's all about investor confidence, so we wanted to make this a little bit tougher on you guys. What will sink the most deals globally next year? Me Too and related HR issues, national security, CFIUS, and antitrust regulations, or GDPR and data security compliance issues? And Hazel, do you want to kind of talk us through why these concerns are even up here while the audience answers?
Sure. Actually, I will vote for national security as the most noteworthy issue that is likely to bring uncertainty to the deal-making process at the global level. Actually, over the past few years, we have seen that major jurisdictions such as the US, some of the major European countries have been intensify their enforcement against foreign direct investment, or in the process of coming up with new legislations trying to tighten their control in this respect. Taking US as an example, it has blocked or causing the parties to abandon deals more than it has never done before. For example, one of the most hyped transactions that were abandoned because of the CFIUS regime is Ant Financial's proposed acquisition of MoneyGram. And CFIUS has even been expanding its powers by introducing mandatory filing obligations, which apply not only to Chinese investors, but also to all non-US investments. For example, under the program, which entered into force in November last year, just a couple of months ago, any non-US investment into a new list of critical technologies will have to be filed mandatorily to the CFIUS, and a failure to abide by this obligation can lead to penalties as high as the deal value itself. And also there is a 30-day standstill obligation attached to this new regime, which will delay the deal-making process, to say the least. We have also seen similar trends followed by key European countries like Germany, like Italy, France, UK. Even at the Commission level, a new regulation is on foreign direct investment is about to come into effect as early as May. So this has all added up to the uncertainties brought to investor confidence in this market. Well, I think it is fair to say that it is important to have planning at a very early stage, try to identify the potential stakeholders and the potential roadblocks, and design a total strategy, and try to be creative and flexible.
Yeah. No, it makes a lot of sense. And I'm curious, let's take a quick look to see what the audience has to say here. Wow. All right. It looks like they all agree with you, Hazel. And just quickly, I have to mention that I think from the state side of things, people are also extremely concerned about the impact of CFIUS and national security regulations. And we actually asked this question I think way back in October, and quite a number of deal makers said they were somewhat to very concerned about this. So it's really, I think, a global issue. And here you can also see again that national security and antitrust, like in APAC, dominated both EMEA and the Americas. with, I'd say, actually, strangely enough, Americans are slightly more concerned about GDPR than EMEA dealmakers are. So it may be a kind of familiarity breeds contempt kind of thing. But I thought that was quite interesting. But Simon, I did want to ask on kind of like what your thoughts were. If, it seems like Me Too and related HR issues doesn't get that much love despite dominating a lot of headlines this year. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think as we look at deals, the culture is so important. So when I'm answering the question, I think that's right. But when we first start looking at a business, that cultural assessment is so important. So deals don't get started unless we believe there is a cultural fit and a belief that there isn't that sort of toxic environment that would breed those type of issues. So it is really important it's front of mind, because driving that cultural fit is absolutely critical for any success, any transaction to be a success, particularly in this market, in this region. Okay.
All right. So we're moving on to our last question in this section. Actually, we're not. Sorry. We're moving on to our next section, which is our APAC due diligence considerations, where we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the topics, really honing in on best practices and kind of local perspectives of deal making. And to kick us off, I'm just going to ask all the panelists to tell us what do they think are best practices in conducting due diligence in APAC. And Chris, do you want to start us out on this?
Sure. So I have 3 pointers. One is some of these markets, reputable, independent coverage of the markets is lacking. So what you really need to do is use a very large variety of data sources and corroborate those data sources as much as you can. Secondly, a big focus should be on the management teams, even more so than in other markets. These markets rapidly change, and the reality is an agile management team that's able to change strategy and execute effectively is so much more important than just a strategy in and of itself. You also need to really invest in the region and look at what we consider as lines and trends versus dots or snapshots in time. Understand the ecosystem, see how the companies and actors develop over time, and that would help give you much more context and better decision making when it comes to conducting due diligence and doing deals in APAC.
Okay. And Simon, what's your view?
I think the key thing is it takes time. A lot of it is relationship based, and really taking the time to understand not only the business but also the individuals, and just being very conscious around compliance related issues that are a lot more prevalent in this region compared with certainly the Western markets. So just going with eyes wide open, being prepared to ask the slightly uncomfortable questions in a way that builds the relationship and doesn't destroy it is really important.
And are there any kind of good war stories that either of you can share to sort of illustrate the points, things that you've kind of run across that were surprising, or that actually should be, that foreign investors particularly should be prepared for?
I've got a good example, Abby. A few years ago, we were looking at a business in Africa, and the financial diligence report came back saying that the financial systems improved greatly when they introduced Microsoft Excel. And this was only sort of 3-4 years ago. So it does, and this was a deal we went through with. It was a great business, just previously documented its accounts on a physical ledger. So just being aware of just because a business doesn't confine with the norms doesn't mean it's not a business. And actually, it's doing really well within our organisation. So it's a lot of differences.
But I'd expect them more opportunity too. Oh, sorry, Chris, go ahead.
It's actually gobsmacking. Here we are in 2019, and for a unnamed country and an unnamed company, when we first spoke to the CFO, we said, well, can we have a look at the books? And I just couldn't believe in 2018, he looked at us and said, which books are you looking for?
Chris, unfortunately, that is all too common.
All too common, and still hasn't disappeared yet.
No.
Oh, that's really funny. All right, so moving on and sort of fitting into the conversation here, we wanted to ask them some more APAC specific polling questions. And one of them that we talked about is, when agreeing to a deal, what is most important to APAC deal makers? Price, cultural fit, relationship, or strategic alignment? So audience, fire up your fingers, give it a shot. And while you're answering, I'm going to ask Chris and Simon to weigh in again. Chris, do you want to start us off?
I got to say, Simon is right on the ball when he talks about taking the time to develop the relationships. And for us, the relationships are tantamount because, these are the people that understand the markets. These are the people that understand the actors. These are the people that have the relationships required in order to get things done. This is the hardest and most sought after asset to acquire. Even if you look at technology companies, I think when you call a technology company, it's still a furphy. The reality is any technology company has the right people running it and the right people with the right relationships to do everything that company needs to succeed. So I'm right up there with Simon when we talk about relationships and then cultural fit.
Okay. And Simon, anything you want to add here?
Yeah, the cultural fit for us is absolutely critical. And when we say cultural fit, we mean corporate culture, not individual market culture. We're not after automatons or replicas of a business. We believe in diversity of thought, but having core values at the heart of an organization that matches with our corporate culture is so critical for success. If that isn't right, then there will continually be tension and disagreement and on approaches, and that results in a deal just not unlikely to be successful, particularly in people-based businesses.
Okay, well let's take a look at what the audience has to say. All right, so it looks like a lot of people did say culture and relationship, but most people actually said strategic alignment, which is quite interesting. And then next off was price, which is I have to say price is definitely more of a traditional. I would see, that was always sort of the theme in the States and in EMEA. So it's interesting to me how a lot of these factors are all the same, but sort of in different orders of priority or emphasis. Okay, moving on to that point, and this is kind of my favorite question because I know that this is such a broad, I'm sure everyone who's watching this has a different answer, a multitude of answers, but what do foreign investors get wrong about APAC? And Hazel, do you want to kick us off here?
Sure. From the regulatory perspective, my observation is that foreign investors sometimes underestimate the importance of control regime in the APAC region or the willingness of the antitrust authorities in the region to enforce the law. Actually, it took quite some years for foreign investors to realize, for example, the Chinese antitrust authorities can be different, can be more unpredictable, and the process itself involves a consideration of policies that is more than the competition-based. For example, in the China merger controls review process, the Antitrust Authority will reach out to other stakeholders, such as other government agencies, trade associations in China, major customers, or sometimes even competitors. Their views can sometimes have influence over the merger control review process, and also sometimes even the outcome of the. And the Chinese authorities can be creative when it comes to designing the remedies imposed on the transaction. So nowadays, I think that foreign investors have fully realized how important the Chinese antitrust regime could be. So very often we will be involved at the very early stage of the deal planning process, sitting together with our US and EU colleagues to come up with a very comprehensive risk assessment and filing strategy for our clients to help them to get the deal through.
All right. And Chris, over to you. What did foreign investors get wrong?
Not enough people, including myself, spend enough time listening. Really, you have to work very hard at being a contributor to the ecosystem before you can aggressively position yourself as a beneficiary. So listen to what all the actors have to say, understand their motivations, find a way of how you can play a role in contributing to that ecosystem first versus, just looking at how you can just benefit from the market.
Okay. Simon, you want to take a shot?
Yeah, sure. I think it's the importance of relationships and the time it takes to build those relationships, because it's only through those relationships that you can then truly understand the business that you're looking at. And what I found, having sort of had sort of roles within UK and EMEA and coming here, there's such big differences between sort of generally accepted practices as a local business compared with something that would be acceptable at an international level. So really trying to understand that and solve and be creative and solve those problems whilst maintaining the relationship is absolutely critical and can be very challenging and often just takes far longer than sort of foreign investors or Western investors sort of believe when they first come here.
No. So if I have to take out a common theme from what you're all saying, it seems like it's time, which is, time to make sure that you handle the regulatory authorities correctly, and that the lawyers are brought in from the beginning the way they are in other regions. Time to really listen and understand and contribute to the ecosystem. And again, time to build that relationship and those understanding. So that would be kind of my takeaway from what all of you are saying. All right. So moving on again to more risks. And again, APAC specific risks. And I apologize. It's a lawyer in me. I can't help myself. But what issue will sink the most in APAC? It's got to be the generalist lawyer. I can't explain it otherwise. What issue will sink the most deals in APAC this year? Corruption and bribery, regulatory compliance, inaccurate facts and figures, or just culture clashes? And Hazel, do you want to weigh in on your thoughts here while the audience is answering?
Sure, absolutely. Actually, from my perspective, like I mentioned earlier, I generally believe that in the APAC region, it is more deal friendly compared with the trends globally, where foreign direct investment may encounter obstacles from the regulators. So I remain generally optimistic about the regulatory environment in the APAC region.
Okay. All right. And Chris, what do you think?
Culture clashes.
Is that it?
Yes, so stemming from everything that we've talked about, it's really just the misunderstandings between the market cultures. And I like Simon's distinction that, you know, it's when he's talking about a corporate culture, it's very different from market culture. And actually, the thing that drives a lot of M&A is a lot of the market cultures here want to join a bigger story. And so when you look at Simon's company, you know, one of the big attractions is that bigger story and that connection and the ability to discover other market cultures and the ability to discover at the same time a corporate culture. So the ability to, you know, truly keep local, but also to contribute and to be part of something global. But, you know, there's work to be done to do that. And that is really the issues that sink most of the deals in APAC, and will continue to do so this year.
Interesting. All right. Well, let's take a look at what the audience has to say on our final polling question. Okay, it's regulatory compliance. I think maybe we got everyone sufficiently concerned with all of the national security and antitrust talk. So that is interesting, as well as, you know, inaccurate facts and figures and culture clashes. But I do think what you're saying about culture clashes is so interesting. And, you know, from my own experience, I remember it wasn't even just the obvious stuff. It was even just kind of definitions. Like when we went into the Asia market with our basic M&A definitions, like what is an acquisition? And then you find out that, for example, in Japan, that terminology, at least at the time, was, you couldn't say acquisition. It had to be, you know, partnership. So even little things like that, I think, could cause a lot of confusion. I don't know. Simon, do you have any other kind of similar war stories?
Yeah, I think if there's a good relationship and a good cultural fit, the other issues can be resolved. You know, inaccurate figures, you know, diligence process, you can get accurate figures, you can understand what they are, and then have a genuine discussion about what impact that has on the deal. But that cultural clash is very difficult to fix. If you don't have that strong relationship, everything else flows from that. And I feel that whilst the direct impact, maybe, you know, inaccurate figures or regulatory compliance or anything else, if there's the right attitude, those things can be fixed. But without that cultural fit or that strong relationship, nothing can be fixed. And it would be very rare in this market for there not to be issues coming out of diligence. There's always something.
All right. Well, we are now at our lightning round predictions for 2019 before getting into some audience Q&A. So really quickly, predictions for 2019. Chris, what do you have to say?
Yeah, for us, it's Vietnam. Just fantastic, big population, high growth, high-tech manufacturing, wonderful energy of the people. Very bullish on Vietnam. Okay, cool. And Simon?
I think it's certainly in our industry, this the diversity of acquirers. So the traditional acquirers, we've seen a sort of a fairly significant trending downwards over the last 3 years, but there's been a lot more new entrants. So recently, you know, the management consultancies, S4, but also non-traditional buyers coming into the market. So is really important. I think we'll see a lot more of.
Okay, great. All right, now we get to the really fun part, audience Q&A. And I'm going to kick off with this one question here for Hazel, which is, what are some red flags that you look for in due diligence?
Sure. When it comes to deal planning, one thing that is becoming even more important than before is to really fully understand your target, what business it is engaged in, where it is located, who its customers are, and what data it possesses in particular. So the reason to raise this is because if we if we are at the foreign direct investment controls around the rules around the globe, very often we can see that sectors such as critical technology, critical infrastructure, advanced technologies such as AI and robotics, and also sectors or companies that are data intensive. These are all included on the list of targets that will be undergoing stricter scrutiny from the FDI perspective. So it is really important for us to get prepared and to be able to identify the issues very early on. I mean, in one of the transactions we handled, we're able to identify the risk very early on by doing actually a desktop research of the target itself and identify the sensitive assets. And because we are able to identify the risk very early on, we developed quite a creative strategy with the clients by divesting the businesses at question to a fund actually designated by the foreign government, which ensured a quite smooth approval process of the transaction.
Great. All right, and we've got some really good audience questions also coming in. So I think, Simon, I'm going to direct this one to you, and it's, how does the due diligence process differ in distinct countries? For example, Singapore versus Vietnam, or does the process remain pretty much the same?
I think the process remains pretty similar, but it's obviously different things are prioritised depending on the risks that are seen. So, for example, in Vietnam, there's probably a greater risk of compliance-related issues, so that would have a greater focus compared with Singapore. But broadly, the process remains similar, just different focuses, different orders, and also just recognising the individual targets. So I would say the process is tailored more specifically for individual targets rather than individual markets, and what are the specific risks that have been identified.
And Chris, I'm curious if you have anything to add, because I know Vietnam is is kind of your big story for next year. So do you have sort of thoughts on doing due diligence in Vietnam?
Sure. So, in Vietnam and in any jurisdiction, and just to take some points from Hazel's point of view, the region is overall getting more friendly towards, having foreigners come in, setting up, hiring, all those things that are required when you look at investing into these countries. And really for us, when we look at various markets, we spend some time to understand what the policymakers are really driving at. Because at the end of the day, when you see a more relaxed policy around data, for example, or compared to other jurisdictions, or a more relaxed view on antitrust competition, it's really because they're at a development stage where they would actually rather have these companies there in the first place. But, they're not there providing these services to, for example, a large underbanked population in the first place. So, for us, if you have a look at the regulations, etc., what you need to do is have a look at the regulations over time, make an understanding of, where the real public policy is at, and that really will help shape the due diligence around regulatory issues, etc. There was case studies in where some of these more innovative companies have maybe operated in what would consider to be, traditionally restricted industries in maybe potentially illegal manner. However, what's happened is the government's gone out and said, look, these companies are solving a real problem. It's the public good. The regulation is not meant to just, create work for bureaucrats and lawyers. The regulation is really to drive the public good. So we have a slightly, pragmatic and I guess, just by the book, look at due diligence when it comes to regulation, etc. And when we look at markets, we actually very much take a strategic view of the market. Where are they going in terms of regulation policy, what particular industries, and that helps us assess, I guess, the country market risk a little bit differently. And from there, we don't just look at the traditional tools of reports, etc. We look at things like sentiment. We actually have a couple of interesting companies around the region using big data and AI that, have a look at really public policy, where it's going, etc. There's a fantastic company in Singapore, for example, called TSE that does this. So, for us, just having new and different ways of looking at it, we feel gives deal makers and due diligence and decision makers, processes and decision makers the edge.
And Chris, I am kind of curious. So, in my former life, when I had a global role, people actually would occasionally come up to me and say, can you have one of your journalists, check to make sure that, XYZ warehouses really exist and there are really these, these materials there, which of course that wasn't our role. But I was always astonished people would actually ask us to do that. So, in addition to sort of these high level policy considerations, I'm curious, what are some practical on the ground due diligence practices that you've seen or that you can advise on, coming kind of from that perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we are actually in 2019, and I guess, a lot of things that we thought might be science fiction aren't really science fiction anymore. So, for example, satellite surveillance is real, and satellite surveillance, I know companies are using in a very real way to capture, the physical environment. The other thing is traditionally if you look at due diligence, it's been around historical data or data at a point in time. It's about information at a snapshot. What we look at is information flows. So to the extent that, again, you can have a look at, specific companies to help you that look at data flows and different proprietary sources of data, that's all very useful. So, I can give you another example where, for example, in China, I know that there is a mobile phone charging company, and what they do is they sell their product subsidized for the fact that they actually sell the data around whether consumers charge their batteries when it's flat or whether consumers charge their batteries whether it's half full, etc. And they sell the data on whether consumers are risk averse or not, depending on when they actually charge their batteries. And they sell that data on to credit agencies and other agencies. So really new ways of looking at data and due diligence and intelligence, in fact, when we talk about this whole topic.
Wow. Okay, that's really fascinating. And of course, I want to know, as someone who continuously has her phone charging, what it all means. It's so interesting. And I also love the satellite point, because for years I just had this picture of like people standing on boxes outside warehouse windows trying to get that information. Next audience question. When and how should HR topics be addressed in the M&A process? Simon, can you provide us some color on that?
Yeah, sure. I think the simple answer is right up front when making an assessment around the culture. And I know I'm going to sound a bit like a broken record coming back to this, but it is so important that having that right corporate culture, that right environment sort of assessment really early is really important. And I think it's sort of initial assessment, and then that's continually verified all the way through. And if there are any concerns around that, then it's something that absolutely should be dug into and considered and really pushed until sort of full understanding and full comfort. I think I do believe that if there are any concerns around these sort of areas, it's just an absolute no-go. To an absolute deal breaker.
Okay. All right. So we are actually at the end. I was about to keep going for a while. I lost track of time, but we are at the conclusion of our webinar. So first and foremost, Thank you to our panelists and thank you to our fabulous audience. It's been a really interesting and engaging conversation. Last chance to fill out the survey when the webinar ends. You'll get a replay within 24 hours. And feel free again to learn how DataSite One supports the entire M&A life cycle. So thank you again and hope to see you next time.